Break down legal matters, and he is here once again to help us understand exactly what this means. So, Neama, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Josh, thanks for having me. Excited to be on as always.
Of course. Well, first off here, can you break down what this ruling overall actually means?
Well, state Supreme Courts, just like the U.S. Supreme Court, they are courts of discretionary appeal. That means they don't have to take cases, and they often choose not to. This recently happened with this U.S. Supreme Court with respect to Special Counsel Jack Smith's request to expedite the presidential or executive immunity appeal. The U.S. Supreme Court said no, and that means that it's going to go through the normal appellate process. Well, here in Michigan, because the Supreme Court denied the request to review the case, that means the lower court, the appellate court decision stands, and Trump will remain on the ballot there.
Is that a surprising ruling to have come down? Is that kind of what you would expect to have happen?
I think the Colorado Supreme Court's ruling was surprising. And really the question here is, we all know what the 14th Amendment says and Section 3's prohibition on anyone who engages in insurrection. They can't hold federal public office. But really the question, Josh, is how is the 14th Amendment executed? And who executes it? So that's why you hear all this discussion of law professors and constitutional scholars, some of whom say, well, the 14th Amendment is self-executing. The question is a state Secretary of State, is that the person who's the appropriate individual to determine whether someone stays on the ballot or not? And Colorado is unique in some ways, and it actually imposes an affirmative duty on both candidates to certify that they're eligible, and the Secretary of State there to determine whether someone is eligible. But Michigan has no analogous provision under Michigan election law there. So that's what the Supreme Court said, well, there's no duty here, so this is not something for our election officials to decide.
And this is really something that hasn't been an issue in the past, right? This whole, I guess, provision that we're talking about has never really been discussed. It's never been a part, really, of a legal case.
It really hasn't, Josh, and that's the challenge here. We're talking about an old Civil War era amendment that was meant to keep Confederates and former Confederates off the ballot. It hasn't really been applied for well over 100 years. That's why there's not a lot of precedent, and that's why we're seeing all these inconsistent rulings across the country. I think ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court will have to get involved. So in Michigan, what the courts there ruled was, well, even though the 14th Amendment says someone can't hold federal public office, there's nothing in there that says they can't be on the ballot, much less the primary ballot, which historically is something that political parties use to determine who is their candidate.
Will this have any sort of effect on the Colorado ruling? Does it play any kind of role in that?
It's not precedential necessarily, but I'm sure it's something the Supreme Court's going to look at, because they're going to look at all the decisions across the country. Whereas, some courts have said, well, the folks that are bringing these challenges, they don't have standing, whether they're voters or other candidates for president. Others have said, Donald Trump hasn't been charged with insurrection, much less convicted. So this is not something that is appropriate for a Secretary of State to make this determination. Others have said that this is really a political issue to be decided by Congress. And of course, although Trump was impeached, he was acquitted during his trial in the Senate. And of course, we know what the Michigan ruling says. And Colorado was really the only state, and it was really just by a really razor-thin majority, 4-3, where the Colorado Supreme Court justices deemed Donald Trump ineligible. So I think what the Supreme Court will have to do is look at all these decisions across the country with these very inconsistent rulings and really determine once and for all, how is the 14th Amendment really enforced? Is it something that Congress has to decide? Does it require a conviction, or is it really going to be left up to these state Secretary of States?
And I want to get your legal opinion on this, because legally speaking, if this were to go up to the Supreme Court, the highest level, we know, of course, that there are more conservatives than liberals on the Supreme Court. So for the most part, is all of this more symbolic in nature?
I think it's very likely that the Supreme Court accepts this case, the U.S. Supreme Court, the Colorado case, of course, because it's such a matter of extreme constitutional importance. It's really unprecedented and novel issue. And you do have these inconsistent rulings. It's really what the Supreme Court is meant to do. And like you said, Josh, the justices there lean conservative, some of them very conservative. And of course, 3 of them were appointed by former President Donald Trump himself. So I expect that Trump will convince the Supreme Court to accept the case and that he will win. There are many, many paths to victory for Trump and not so many for his challengers. And at the end of the day, regardless of how you feel about the legal merits, there are many individuals, including liberals and Democrats, who believe that, keeping a major party candidate for president off the ballot for this reason, there's something wrong about that. I mean, you're really disenfranchising millions of voters and you're taking away their choice for president. I mean, even California Governor Gavin Newsom said that this is something that should be decided in the polling booth, not in the courtroom.
All right, Neama Rahmani there, former federal prosecutor. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Anything you want to add before I let you go?
No, Josh, great being on. As always, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
All right, everybody, the time now 11:39 over on the East Coast.